Hello and welcome to episode 3 of a Plain Accounts web series. Just a conversation between some local pastors discussing how to preach from one or multiple of the lectionary passages for this Sunday. I'm very excited to talk about Micah 5 today. Danny Quanstrom here with Ben Kramer. Do you want to say hey, introduce yourself, Ben?
Ben Kramer, pastor of Boise Euclid Church of the Nazarene.
And we also have a special guest, Josh Johnson, with us today. Josh, welcome. You want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure, thanks. I'm Josh Johnson, senior pastor of New Beginnings Church of the Nazarene in Loudon, New Hampshire, so just outside of Concord.
So good to have you here today. Josh is one of our contributors for the commentary series as well. We were just chatting. He's writing on Psalm 51 in February, so be looking for that in the next coming months. Very glad to have him as a contributor in the written portion and also as a participant here with us today. So today we are discussing primarily, though maybe not exclusively, I don't know, we'll see where it goes, Micah 5, 2 through 5a. Would you guys be all right if I read through the text that we have before us?
Please.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, Micah 5, 2 through 5a from the NRSV. But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from of old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has brought forth. Then the rest of his kindred shall return to the people of Israel, and he shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall live secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be the one of peace. This is the written word of the Lord, right? Micah 5:2. Good words coming from the prophet Micah today. So, I guess one of our first questions is, what is the historical context? Can we speak for a little bit about what's going on in Judah at this time?
Do you want to start, Ben, or do you want me to?
Well, I think I'll speak on what intrigues me most and then leave the conversation to those who know more about the context. What intrigues me most is their shift from trade to mercantilism and how much that impacts their religious and ethical life during this time in Judah. You have a lot of people, kind of infants, to the impact of what greed can do to your perspective of the world and perspective of others. We as 21st century Americans have just been grafted into capitalism, and it's just been an assumed natural way of being. But to the Israelites at this time, mercantilism is a new practice. It's a new form and function, and so we see that sort of chaos that it ensues when they're learning how to shape their life by this new economic practice. So that's just something that's really intriguing to me and something I want to keep in mind as I study this text to preach to my congregation.
Rather than like the barter system, right?
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, they're kind of for the first time paying for goods rather than exchanging goods between them. That is an interesting dynamic in the history in which Micah is writing. Anything else, Josh, you want to add on the historical context? Maybe who is Micah?
Yeah, that's interesting with the shift in the way the economy of the culture is working. It's not something that I'm really familiar with, so that's interesting to hear. I know that Micah obviously is prophesying in the south, in the nation of Judah, but he's prophesying at a critical time for the north, because he's prophesying over the course of maybe 50 years, just before, just during, and just after the fall of the northern kingdom. So Northern Kingdom falls about 722 BC, and or BCE, and he's prophesying right through that. So that's an interesting dynamic to be talking in Judah when the most significant thing probably happened in the history of Israel since the division is occurring in the north. And Micah is situated in the 12 prophets in the First Testament between Jonah and Nahum, probably for good reason, because Jonah is a prophet to the city of Nineveh, and God shows mercy to them, at least temporarily. Nahum, also a prophet to the city of Nineveh, but prophesying their destruction, which assuredly happens. And Micah there right in between, because he's prophesying sort of in between Jonah and Nahum in the south, but prophesying in a time in which the Assyrian Empire, which Nineveh is the capital of, is destroying the northern kingdom. So there's a lot of dynamics there in terms of what's happening in Israel when Micah is doing his ministry.
Yeah, and when you think about the Micah 5:2, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, right? I mean, he's talking about the city of David as a southerner, which is a very interesting dynamic. Yeah, that's interesting, this being sandwiched between the Nineveh prophecies. That's something I hadn't put together.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, at least in our arrangement. There are arrangements of the 12 where he's not in the middle, but in our arrangement, which follows the Septuagint, he is.
Right. Anything else we need to know about the history?
A couple other things occur to me, and then you guys can chime in obviously too. But one of the things I think that's important to recognize is that Micah's prophecies don't appear to be chronological, meaning like it's not as though you find his early prophecies in chapter 1 and his later prophecies in chapter 5. These seem to be oracles that were done throughout a 50-year period of ministry, arranged maybe thematically. At least that seems to be the way a lot of the scholarship goes, though there's a lot of debate over exactly how it's being organized. But there's sort of this loose organization of prophecies of doom, prophecies of lament, prophecies of hope, kind of clustered in at least 3 segments in the book. So it's one of those weird First Testament books that it's tough to preach contextually.
Yeah.
Because the context is hard to figure, because when's he prophesying? Did he say this oracle after the north fell, before the north fell, while it was falling? Who knows?
And then you read all these scholars, and they all say something different.
Right. Yeah, nobody can agree.
There's no consensus on A, who Micah is, or B, when he's writing certain oracles within the prophecy. What is the historical context? It's hard to say what.
The most important thing about Micah is just the meaning of his name, which is from 3 Hebrew words: me, which is kind of who, and cha, which is like, and then Yahweh, which is God. So who compares to God? Who is like God? It's sort of this, his name is a question.
Yeah.
And it's a time in Israelites' history where that question has real teeth, because the promises made to Abraham look as though, at least in part, they're falling to pieces, because the north is falling.
What's intriguing to me, coming from Zephaniah last week, is I sensed a bit of organization in that light as well, where we hear a prophetic voice of joy calling people to praise, but you have in the midst of that whole gloomy prophetic message to begin with. So it feels like it's contingent on exile. When the people are in exile, when they are out of exile, and it's more organized based on speaking to a people in their present needs. Because scholars couldn't agree on Zephaniah's placement either. Is this speaking joy to a people who have already encountered exile and are in the midst of that entrapment? And it would make sense, being a people who are in bondage for so long in Egypt, that that's how they would organize their messages, is like, we know what it feels like to be in bondage. We know what it feels like to be in exile. So we sort of organize our messages around bringing hope and peace into the areas we know, and longing for the promises that God has long since told us will be fulfilled. It just made me think that maybe the organization is contingent on their proximity to exile, whether it's within, without, or anticipating or building up to that.
Yeah, and I think there's little doubt that most of these books find their final form in exile. Maybe after, but most of them probably in exile. But Brevard Childs has said, and I kind of follow this when I'm studying the prophets, that it seems like the process of canonizing these texts deliberately obscured their historical context. It's almost as though the Hebrew people deliberately wanted to take away clues that we would want to see if we wanted to know exactly when they were being spoken. And I have a sense part of that is, and I think this figures into Micah, is that the feeling that they get in exile, being disempowered, being kind of at the prey of other powers, not being able to be self-determinative, worship the Lord the way that they would want to if they were following the law, that experience of being sort of the faithful people of God without any ability to live out that faithfulness deliberately and consistently is the quintessential Hebrew experience. I mean, whether they're in exile or they're in their own land as vassal states to the Assyrian Empire or to the Babylonians or to the Egyptians or whatever's happening in their history, they're always sort of a disemboweled people. You know, they have the high ideals, the law of Moses, with very little ability to live them out deliberately. And I think that's part of why it's been obscured. I mean, they might have been writing it at exile, but in some ways, exile, I don't think, was a new experience for the Israelite people. I mean, it is. They're no longer in the land, but I mean, Judges and the experiences of the split of the North and the South, and then more powerful nations around them constantly exercising authority over them and their religiosity. They're always in exile, whether they're in the land or not, and that comes into Jesus too.
And that makes me think of something Scott Daniels has said before on you can take the Israelites out of Egypt. I believe it was Scott Daniels, but you can't so much take the Egypt out of the Israelites. Or as I preached the other week, you know, as the Israelites were coming out of Babylonian exile, you can take the Judeans out of Babylon, out of exile. You can't so much take the exile out of the Judeans. They're kind of perpetually in this exilic state, even when they have rulers, right?
Yeah, there's so few rulers that really live into Torah.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what's so fascinating about the flip side of that statement is how long do they need to be in the promised land and shaped by that promise before it's not taken out of them when they're sent over into exile? Like, why are they so quick to give up what they have been shaped by in Israel, in the promised land, when they're in exile? Why do the prophets have to keep calling them back? What makes them so allergic to Torah that they continue to abandon it and not be shaped by them? Because you don't hear the converse phrase, well, they went to Babylon and they had to get Israel out of them. It just happens. They kind of just let go of their heritage.
And that makes me think, like, okay, maybe this might be jumping ahead in the episode, but something you were talking about, Josh, just made me say, what about us? Like, what was it about Israel that made it so hard for them to follow Torah, whether in or outside of exile? And something that you said just kind of made me think, well, what about us? I mean, do we have an excuse for not living as faithfully as maybe we should? Is there something do we live as people in exile? Have we lived as people in exile while not being in exile? Or on our way to exile, perhaps, culturally, a cultural exile?
Yeah, as I'm thinking about it, I obviously don't know the answer to why they continued to have failed, though I certainly appreciate it because we have done the same thing. Like you said, it's not as though anything has changed. I've never been that comfortable with the typical Protestant answer since Luther to say that they were just doomed to failure because God wanted to show us in a visceral way that the law is impossible to keep. Mm-hmm. And so Israel is kind of the buffoon in theology, like they thought they could follow a law that God never intended them to follow just so that they could teach the rest of us that you can't do it on your own strength. I've never been very comfortable with that because of what it does to the people of Israel.
Right.
But I think there's something about this messianic hope, and that's what we have in Micah that keeps, I think in some ways, and I'm just saying this, I could be wrong, but I think that it's the very hope of the Messiah that becomes a problem for the Israelite people because they keep thinking that it's going to take an ideal context to live out the Torah faithfully. You got to have the perfect king, you got to have no enemies, you got to have rich and abundant crops and no real source of angst. And once you get that kind of perfect environment, which is the messianic hope, you're going to have a perfect people. And they keep running into trouble because they're never in that environment. They never are. Mm-hmm. But to come to us, we still have that same feeling, right? If we get the right president, the right Congress, the right kind of economic policies, the right system of, capitalism or whatever else, it would just get all those things and diminish poverty and heal diseases and kind of marginalize cancer. that's going to be the key, the Star Trek hope of the perfect society, where people will finally lay down this competitive, greed-driven hunger for more, and they'll just unite as one people to improve humanity. Like, we're going to do that by getting our context right, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Israel kept thinking that was the key to holiness, is getting the right rulers in the right context, and it just never worked for them. Somehow we have to envision a way to be the people of God in the midst of circumstances that are working against that. And I'm not sure Israel ever figured it out. I'm not sure I figured it out.
Right.
Well, one phrase that keeps coming to mind as you were speaking, that there's just so much goodness there. But a phrase from Howard Wasta says, the Old Testament is so valuable to us because Israel was faithful to record her unfaithfulness, and how much we can learn from that diligence. They could have just sugarcoated history and said, this is where we got it right, good luck. But they gave us the testament of their unfaithfulness to show God's faithfulness to them. And how much we, again, the age-old story of relying on our own righteousness, relying on our own ways of doing things, rather than trusting and relying on God, and we, again, end up in unfaithfulness. And we need to be honest with that before we can see God being faithful.
Mm.
Yeah, so we've talked a bit about the historical context. We've talked a little bit about the literary context. We're starting to move into kind of the so what of the conversation. And I want to be able to jump right into that, but I'm curious if you have anything else that you think is important for us in preaching this text historically, or in terms of the literary context. Is there anything we need to know, maybe particularly about the literary context? Is there anything we need to know about how the text is written that should inform our preaching?
I sort of mentioned this before, and I think it remains important to reiterate, is that these oracles seem to have been assembled thematically from throughout a 50-year ministry. So I think we just have to be appreciative of that. And so what you think of as literary context in, like, the Gospel of Mark or in Genesis, we're not going to find in Micah. But we still have to think in terms of thematic context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's some poetry throughout the book. It's not exclusively poetic, though, right?
No, I don't. Well, no, there are probably sections that aren't, but it's mostly poetry from our perspective. The kind of poetry you find in prophets.
Right.
Yeah, and I think important also to recognize that there's a pattern that repeats itself from Micah, and that pattern is important, of judgment, doom, prophecies of doom, lament, repentance, which is the appropriate response to judgment, and then hope. You know, that it gives us the sense. I mean, Micah's written in the midst of a terrible time, and they're told at least three things. God is in control. This is partially or maybe even mostly your fault. And it's not the end of the story.
Yeah. Now, so, thinking about that with God is in control, it's partially your fault, that made me think of a couple articles I was reading about the violent language in Micah. There's violent language, then there's the language that mirrors Isaiah. We'll beat our swords into plowshares, right? Swords will be beaten to plowshares and the pruning hooks. It's you have the 7 rulers and the 7 humans who have this kind of violent activity, and then there's the one from Bethlehem. There's this violent overtone. Do we see in Micah that responding to the violence of the Assyrians, responding in like violence, is the unfaithful response of Israel? Do we see that, or do we see kind of this adoption of violence from Yahweh? Because I've seen kind of both interpretations of this text. Yet we have in our passage for today, the one from Bethlehem, he shall be the one of peace. is the way in which this peace is realized important?
Do you want to speak to that, Ben?
I'm just kind of reeling from it myself. I'd probably appreciate hearing a little bit more of that in depth.
Yeah, I think the violence question is huge, and it's sort of thorny to get into because we're in a time in which violence is probably not the response we want to encourage, but I don't think we can be reactionary and act as though God never has encouraged violence, because I think he has. But I think the Israelite people misunderstood what the violence was for. And I'm not saying I know what it's for, but I think I know what it was not for. And I don't think, like when God encouraged the Amalekite destruction and some of the other times where he seems to have overtly commanded the Israelites, at least by the testimony of the prophets, to do violence. I think Israel, at least by the time of Jesus, came to believe that they were supposed to wipe out the Amalekites because that's how the kingdom of God comes. It's not really pictured that way, though, in Genesis, for instance, where the destruction of the Canaanite people is judgment that's held off for 450 years. It's not because God needs violence to bring the kingdom, it's because judgment is necessary. And that theme runs over and over again through the First Testament, and Israel finds itself in the position the Amalekites found themselves in Micah's day, because a more powerful nation is coming in and now doing to them what they had been commanded to do it to the Amalekites by the same God and for the same reason. And so violence is there, but it's not how the kingdom comes. God's kingdom doesn't come by violence. It serves another purpose. And I think that's the debate maybe we should have. But I think the violent language in Micah is because judgment is coming. And God's judgment in the First Testament almost always comes through this kind of warfare. And in the New Testament, too, I mean, you have some. Ananias and Sapphira, for instance, and some other examples. But I think the Israelite people have misunderstood, and they thought that God's kingdom came through violence. I think Jesus exposes how they've misinterpreted that. And so Micah's prophecy here is that the real ruler is going to be a ruler of peace. And it's not going to be necessarily violence that brings that final and ultimate kingdom, even though violence has been a part of the old kingdom of God.
Right. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yes. So would you say that the one, because the passage in Luke comes to mind that I've been hearing a lot lately about, if you don't have a sword, sell your clothes to get one.
Yeah.
And it's used a lot in kind of defense for self-defense and concealed carry. But are we to interpret passages like that and saying, well, only those who understand what violence means in accordance with God's judgment should then be the ones who carry the swords among us? I've been wrestling with that in light of the violence that I've been reading in Micah and other prophets as well.
Yeah, I always like to be a little subversive myself and say you have to, if Jesus wants you to have a sword, because how else are you going to fulfill the prophecy to turn it into a plowshare?
Yeah.
You have to have it, right? So I think two swords weren't enough on the night Jesus was betrayed, and yet he seems to indicate that two was sufficient. Why? Because, somehow the kingdom adopts the weapons of war and turns them into vessels of peace. And so we have to have the weapons to transform them. I think that's a little bit of the imagery going on with Jesus. Because if he really wants to raise a rebellion, he did a terrible, terrible job.
Yeah, okay, so we've got a little less than 10 minutes left. So what? How do we preach Micah 5:2 through 5a?
Yeah, I preached this a couple years ago and did a terrible job, I feel like. I went back over the sermon, I thought, wow, that was not good. But I think one of the key insights, one of the key things I think Micah is saying in chapter 5, verses 2 through 5a, is this idea of the origin of the Messiah being ancient. And one of the problems, of course, with this text is that we all have memorized it who are Christians. We memorized it when we were kids, and we think we know what it means, and we think of that prophecy of the origin of this king being old from ancient times as thinking that this is somehow talking about Jesus as divine, the pre-incarnate Son, whose origins are before the creation of the earth or something like that. At least that's what I was taught.
But we didn't memorize it because of Micah, right? We memorized it because of Matthew.
Right, that's true.
We
Yeah.
memorized it because that's what Herod's scribes said, not because we read the Old Testament prophecy.
Right. But I think one of the key insights that somehow has to come into this is that the most natural place for the Messiah to come from would be Jerusalem, the kingly line of David. But he's not. For Micah, God is going to stay in David's family, but he's not going to come through the kingly line that's in Jerusalem. He's going to go back to the beginning, so to speak, back to Bethlehem, to be faithful to his promise to David, but not to use the kingly line. And there's something about Micah, the corruption of the monarchy and the political structure of Israel has become so bad that God's not going to use it. He's going to kind of circumvent it and start over. So Isaiah's language is a sprout will come up from the root of Jesse.
Yeah.
This is this idea that Jesus may be related to David, but he's not going to be in the kingly line, which is the difference between Matthew and Luke's genealogies, right? I mean, Luke pretty much demonstrates that Jesus' line, though it may be rooted in David, doesn't come through the kings. Matthew wants to show that he's the inheritor of the line of David, so he shows the kingly line, but Luke makes it clear that's not his actual heritage. He's Davidic, but he's not kingly. And I think that's the subversive element in this passage for Micah.
Yeah,
the Messiah will come from David, but it's going to come from like that line that everybody forgot. The crazy uncle and that line that nobody wanted to affiliate with, that still live in Bethlehem, that we all disowned. He's going to come from there.
He's going to come from the ruddy-faced shepherd boy, right?
Right. Yeah, David again.
He's going to come, and that's the history of Israel, isn't it? It's with Isaac and Joseph and Jacob and then David. It's these young kids who become the thing they're not supposed to.
Nobodies. They're from the right family, but they're nobody in that family.
Right, and same with Bethlehem, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Bethlehem is one of the least of the clans, one of the little clans, one of the least clans of Judah. Yet it is out of this origin that the Messiah comes.
Yeah, because David's family moved on. They hadn't lived in Bethlehem forever. They lived from Jerusalem. They were the kings. They were the power ones. They forgot where they came from. God runs around and chooses a Messiah from that line, but not from the eldest brothers, not from the ones you'd expect.
Well, so I wonder if there's import for us today in this, in this kind of the root, the beginnings of it, the Bethlehemite. It's as we move. This might be a handle that I can use because I preach in a small town. We don't have an interstate that runs through our county. So there might be a handle there for me in saying, hey, maybe God can still do things through some small town in west central Michigan. God does those things. Historically, that is how God has worked through his people. It's not through the expected means, right? It's through the unexpected, surprising ways. So I could preach it like that, but I'm thinking more generally in terms of our culture, as we're moving out of Christendom, as we're moving away from assuming Christianity is the norm, as we're maybe stepping into a cultural exile. When you look at our political spectrum, when you hear about the conversations between certain groups of Christians, so many people are afraid of losing power, right? Of losing the influence that Christianity has on the West. What's going to happen to this world if we're not this bastion of hope? And I think I want to ask, and through the lens of Micah, do we believe God can bring about his kingdom through a remnant? Because that is what the promise, that's what Micah says, it's this remnant through whom the kingdom will come, through whom God's purposes and God's ways will come. So I'm just curious what do you guys think about that? How can we be building on, how does that play in our world?
lighting the candle of love this Sunday, trying to think of how we can bring this back. I've been challenging my congregation all Advent long to, if each one of us would pick just one person to invest and invite into our midst so that we can inhabit and practice joy, hope, peace, and love together. Imagine what transformation that would have in just one person's life. And then they would go and do likewise. And that's the whole object of discipleship, that we would invest and invite, invest and invite. And hearing your discussions about Bethlehem and the kids nobody cares about, and we're Nazarenes, the people who care about the people that nothing good can come from Nazareth, right? We care about those people, and God continues to ask us, what is the object of your love? Asking Peter 3 times, do you love me? Then feed my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. Are we mindful of the least of these? Those that we don't think anything good can come from. Because we don't think anything good can come from Bethlehem. We don't think anything good can come from anyone who's not from Jerusalem in the realm of royalty. Are we mindful of the least of these? Because Christ then says, however you treat them, as God has shown, he chooses from them. However you treat them, that's how you will also be treated by God. So I think in this whole conversation of economy, you know, I'm from Boise, Idaho, the rural patriotism that is here and very real, and trying to understand our distinct identity as a people who care and love those in our society that nobody thinks anything good about. That we are the people who advocate for them. When nobody else seems to really get that they are where the kingdom will be ushered in through.
I love those insights. I think that's the story of Israel over and over again. God chooses, you know, it's not the fifth generation pastor kid who rises up and becomes the great leader. I mean, God chooses a no-name wandering Aramean to become the father of his chosen people. He chooses the lesser sons, sometimes in lesser families. And this is the prophecy of the Messiah, and certainly what happened with Jesus. I mean, he came from nowhere. Nazareth, what does that mean? Galilee of the Gentiles, not officially in the Davidic line, even though he was somehow connected through marriage and other things. And yet this is who God chooses. So who we might consider to be the least in our churches and our neighborhoods may be out of that group that God will choose the prophets. And I think we're in a great moment in history. I mean, it's terrible because we're being marginalized and around the world oppressed. And, you know, marginalization isn't exactly oppression, but, you know, for us, we've been so comfortable, this feels like oppression. But we're in this moment that has been repeated throughout history. You'd expect transformation for the kingdom of God to come through the Catholic Church, which is so powerful, or the Orthodox Church, which is so historic, or the Methodist Church, which is so numerous for Protestants, or the Southern Baptist Convention. There's these denominations that have been around forever. You'd expect that the power, the change, the transformation will come from there. But it's usually in the moments where those things seem to be being torn down that God rises up prophets from the local yokels. And that's who Micah is. I mean, he's nobody. Who is he? I don't know. He doesn't even come into Kings. I mean, and that's who's Zephaniah? Who's Zechariah? Who is Jonah? Like, they just rise up in the rubble of the falling of the structures that have become corrupted with power and ego and sin and rebelliousness and duplicity. As they get torn down, which always happens, out of that rubble arise these voices. Some of them recognized in their time, Isaiah. Some of them never recognized till long after they're dead, Jeremiah. Others maybe who had a mix of that, Ezekiel. You couldn't tell if he was schizophrenic or if he was from God. So I think we're in this really hopeful moment because it's going to get really bad for the church, I imagine, just because of history. But it's in this moment that God suddenly, after decades, centuries of silence begins to speak again. At least that's what's always happened in the past.
Yeah.
I mean, the Christendom era has happened in read the scriptures. Those are the periods where there's nothing happening.
Yeah.
There's no prophets, no judgment, things are pretty good, kings are ruling. But all of our texts are written about the moments of like this, where Christendom, the kingdom of God, seems to be crumbling.
Yeah.
And it's right there that the future is unmasked every time. So I'm hopeful.
That makes me think of a brief story I want to share before we close our time. I was listening to NPR, and they were talking about a story in Syria, maybe significant in terms of the Assyrians, that we read about in Micah. But a church in Syria, I can't remember the city. The reporter had visited Syria, and a year ago or so, and it was just desolate. Everything was leveled. There was a church that was still standing, but all of the pews were destroyed. All of the icons, all of the sacramental images were gone. There was nothing left in this church. It was destroyed. It was demolished. And now the violence has increased. The questions about what's going to happen are stronger today than they have been in that region. And this reporter went back to this church. And out of the rubble, this church has oak wooden pews. It has the cross back up on the wall. It's decorated for Christmas. There's a Christmas tree in the Syrian church in the corner. There's even a picture. There's even a Santa in one side of this church. And just kind of these out of all these displaced peoples, out of this destruction, this death, there's a remnant coming out of nowhere, speaking to the beauty and the joy and the hope that is the incarnate Christ. Which I think you would never expect that this church in Syria today would have anything resembling the beauty that we might imagine in a cathedral. So to hear that story, I thought was beautiful for the season, and maybe appropriate as we think about where God's kingdom comes from, and from whom God's kingdom comes. It's the lowly ones, right?
Yeah, we want the trees to be tall and the buildings to be beautiful and the freedoms to be absolute. We want that. I think it's good and fine to pursue it. One day that'll be the reality of the new heavens and the new earth. But we're really built for the rubble. We really are. I heard the pastor of Bronx Bethany Church of the Nazarene speak at PalCon, and one of the at ENC, and one of his themes was, we're not really built for Christendom. We're built for moments like this. And I think that's true because Jesus, we think about the story of Jesus as one of self-sacrifice and self-emptying, laying down our lives for others, caring for those who are marginalized, and that's true. But there's a broader story of Jesus that Micah reminds us of. It goes a lot further back than a single human life. And it's that the thing that prepares the way for Jesus is the cutting down of the tree of David so that new sprout can sprout up. And so we're in that moment. We're sort of built to make our churches in the ruins. That's sort of the way we're designed. And so as much as we try and build the big buildings, we're made for this.
Yeah.
This is our time. It's what it means to be salt and light in the world, the same way that Wesley noticed the Moravian Christians did on that boat. As the storm was raging and it looked like they were going to be sunk, and they're sitting there singing praises and having a Bible study, and Wesley's thinking, what's wrong with you people? We're dying here, and what are you doing? Like, what are you reading? But the peace that comes for the church in the midst of this chaos is that God is in the throne. We deserve this. Let's repent, and let's remember that this wouldn't be happening if he didn't have a future for us.
Yeah.
And I think that's Micah.
We are a people of martyrs, not of heroes. We are people who walked back into Rome as it was burning to the ground, even after Caesar, what his atrocities did to us. There's so much truth there.
We're made for this. This is
Yeah.
our time, if we can embrace it. That's Micah.
Yeah, that's Micah. So much. There's so much going on in this text, and there's so many different ways from which to approach it and preach it. And thank you so much, Josh, for joining with us today. Very, very, very much appreciated the conversation. Appreciated your insight, your depth, and your heart in this matter.
Absolutely.
And Ben, always good to be with you.
You as
thank
well.
you. Thank you all for joining in. Hopefully this can be a little bit of help, or maybe we just muddy the waters for you a little bit, which maybe that's helpful too. But
it would be best if we always ended our episodes with, I don't know, like a rainbow and a plane account symbol over our heads that says, "And now you know." I don't know. It's original. It's just an idea, just to throw it out there.
Did you come up with that on your own, Ben?
All by myself.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That sounds a little like G.I. Joe to me, which really resonates with me.
Well, good to be with you both. Thank you so much for your time. You take care, and join us again next week as we jump in again to episode 4.
Peace be with you, brothers.
Peace be with you.
And also with you.